It's LT1 versus LT1 versus LT1.
Okay, where are my LT1 fans out there? Here's a question for you. How does the early 70s Gen 1 LT1 compare to the early 90s Gen 2 LT1 compared to the modern Gen 5 LT1? Let's take a look. In this video, we're going to take a look at 3 different configurations of Chevrolet's LT1. We're going to start off with the original 1970 high compression LT1, originally rated at 370 horsepower in the Corvette or 360 horsepower in the Camaro. Was there really a difference? Let me know in the comments. We're going to compare that motor, kind of the swan song, the last hurrah of the original Gen 1 small block, because after that, they started lowering compression and performance went away. Well, Chevrolet resurrected the LT1 nomenclature and applied it to a Gen 2 LT1 in the early to mid 90s. And that was a good performance motor, a big step up from the L98 that preceded the LT1. Now that LT1 was rated between 285 and 300 horsepower depending on the application. But how do we compare a 300 horsepower motor to a 370 horsepower motor? As we'll see, the power rating played a big part in the difference between these motors, and they're actually more alike than they were different. Now we're going to take both of those then and compare them directly in a back-to-back test to the modern Gen 5 LT1 that we have now, the direct injected version. Very impressive piece, lots of power. This way we can show how technology has marched on from the original muscle car era to the middle of the muscle car era to the current muscle car era. All LT1s. Let's take a look.
Our comparison of the LT1s obviously starts off with the original back in 1970, which was the high compression version. Now they carry that LT1 over into the early 70s, but they lowered the compression and lowered the power output of each version. So 1970 was kind of the high water mark, and run in the Corvette version, it was rated at 370 horsepower, and in the Camaro was 360 horsepower. Now I don't know if that was a marketing deal or a change in the exhaust or whatever reason they're giving for the difference. Usually it's because the Corvette guys wanted to think that they had more power than the Camaro guys because their Corvette cost so much more money. But either way, it was a good motor, and as we see, if you take a look at the video I did on the DZ302 and the L76, which is 365 horse 327, and this LT1 350, you can see a comparison between all of those original muscle car motors and see how well they did and how they compare. But the LT1 basically was kind of the high water mark, and not surprisingly so. As you go up in displacement, it just makes more torque. It makes the motor better. Now, the one thing I would like to have seen on this LT1 is I wish that they would not have changed the camshaft. I wish they would have kept that Duntov cam in there that they use in the 365 horse 327 and the DZ302. If they would have kept that camshaft in the LT1 350, it would have revved out a little bit higher, but the milder cam kind of stopped the RPM potential of this motor. But it does make a lot of power, and it made a lot of torque, as we see here. Now that thing in 1970 was an 11-to-1 compression. It had the 202 160 big valve fuelie heads. It had a dual plane intake, a 780 Holley, and when I ran our reproduction version on the engine dyno, I actually ran it with a 750 Holley and long tube headers. Obviously no accessories, kind of the way that they would have run it back in the day, because when they were measuring the horsepower before they went to the net rating, they were rating it with a different SAE standard and also running it with no accessories and usually headers and open exhaust and all that stuff to show as much power as it could. And they played a lot back in the day with different kinds of power outputs. Some of it, as I said, like the comparison between the Camaro version and the Corvette version, some of it was marketing. Sometimes they overrated it, sometimes they underrated it because they wanted it to do well in specific drag racing classes. There's all kinds of reasoning for what they did with the power outputs. But as we'll see in this one, the rated power output was actually fairly close to the actual power output, at least the way that we tested. Now, all of the versions that you're going to take a look at, this 1970 version, and then the mid-90s version, and then the modern version of 2017 or 2018 LT1, they were all run in the same manner. They were all run on the engine dyno with no accessories, with long tube headers, all of that stuff. So it's kind of a good comparison to see how we've come, how far we've come basically based on technology. But this version, the LT1, had a fairly healthy camshaft in it. It didn't have a lot of lift. It was about 460 on the intake and 485 on the exhaust. But what they did was put a lot of duration in these things. It had a 242, 254 at 50 cam, which is a pretty big size camshaft, and 116 degree lobe separation angle to help this thing, make power. But it was not, again, it was not as big as the version used in the Duntov cam. But equipped as such and run on the engine dyno, this combination produced 353 horsepower, and torque was up pretty well at 391 foot-pounds of torque. So now that we've taken a look at the 1970 version, let's take a look at the Gen 2 LT1, which I think is an underrated motor, and I always want to try to get as much press on that one as I can. I can't wait to get my hands on another one from the wrecking yard. So you guys will get to help out on that after, and I'll show you a video on exactly how you're going to help out coming up pretty soon. After covering the 1970 LT1, we can fast forward to the Gen 2 version, the mid-90s version. Well, I say early to mid-90s version. And this is maybe, I think it can be considered the high water mark of the first gen small block Chevy. I know that they're calling it a Gen 2, but the reality is it shares so much with the original Gen 1 motor. A lot of that stuff is interchangeable. It's basically the same kind of block and crank and rods and pistons and all that stuff. The head and the coolant flow obviously is different, but it's still basically a small block Chevy. So I still consider it a Gen 1 motor, but I'm sure that the real LT1 guys are going to argue with me about that, but that's okay. Now run on our engine dyno, we ran it the same way that we ran the original 1970 version, but if we do a quick comparison, this motor compared to that 1970 version had lower compression. This was only 10.4 to 1 compared to 11 to 1. It had smaller valve heads, although the heads flowed better than the Fuelie heads did. It obviously had a different induction system. It didn't have a dual plane and a Holley carburetor. It had that kind of now famous LT1 short runner EFI intake manifold and dual hole throttle body on it. But as we can see, and we'll run a comparison, and this makes fairly similar power, as you can see, compared to that 1970 version. And a lot of people are going to think, well, that's not much of a evolutionary change from all of that technology. But the reality is, if you look at what happened in between these, that's really the big thing. I mean, we had small blocks that were rated at like 130 horsepower during the smog era. So technology and power just went away while all the manufacturers were adjusting to the smog laws and stuff and trying to get these motors to be both efficient and try to minimize smog. You can't have a camshaft that's 250 degrees at 50 anymore when you're trying to reduce emissions. So what they did was make a version of the small block that was basically as good or better in every way than the original muscle car motors. This thing made every bit as much power. As a matter of fact, it made a little bit more power, but it did so while obviously maintaining better idle quality, longevity, more RPM potential. It got better fuel mileage. It basically did everything better. So run the way that we run this Gen 2 Gen 1 Plus LT1 small block produced 363 horsepower, if I'm correct. Yeah, 363 horsepower. Peak torque was 391 foot-pounds. And unfortunately, I can't do a direct comparison. I can't do an overlay on the graphs between the early one and the late one because we changed the software at Westech because I've been running this stuff for a long time, and we ran this way back, and it just won't overlay with the other ones. But I can do a quick comparison rundown for you. Like at 3,000 RPM, this LT1 made more power and torque than the original one. At 4,000 RPM, they were within 1 foot-pound, so kind of the same there. At 5,000 RPM, this version made more power, this LT1 made more power, and at 6,000 this version also made more power. So this thing is up about 10 or so compared to that original 1970 LT1, and a little bit more than that actually out at 6,000 RPM. This thing made a peak, like I said, 363 horsepower, 391 foot-pounds, compared to 353 horsepower and 392 foot-pounds for the original LT1. So this LT1, as I said, I kind of consider it the last hurrah for the small block Chevy, and the LT4 version even more so, but kind of a specialized deal and obviously very hard to find in any kind of wrecking yard. You can find these LT1s and they're easy to make power with. Obviously the one Achilles heel for these LT1s, the OptiSpark, but the later versions with drain holes and stuff in them kind of overcame a lot of that moisture accumulation, and we've actually had fairly good luck with them. But if you have one, maybe be prepared to change at least one OptiSpark in the life of your LT1. So now let's take a look at the more modern version and see how far technology has really come with our LT1. After comparing the original 1970 LT1 to the Gen 2 LT1, it's time to take a look at the most modern version, the Gen 5. And I need to bring up something important that I missed in the last discussion on the Gen 2 LT1, and that's the camshaft. The camshaft in that Gen 2 motor was a 450/460 lift, 202/207 degree duration split, and 116 degree lobe separation angle. And the reason that I bring that up, other than forgetting to tell you about that in the last segment, is that it shares a very similar camshaft with this new Gen 5 version. That camshaft has a 200/207 degree duration split, 116 degree lobe separation angle, but where the new Gen 5 version differs is that it has much more lift. It's a 551/524 lift split. So the modern version has more cam lift than either the original muscle car motor or the Gen 2 version, which helps it make power. But obviously, we need to address the elephant in the room on this LT1, and that's the displacement. I mean, it's 6.2 liters compared to only 5.7 liters for the other two. Does that make the comparison not fair? Actually, it does, but you guys can go ahead and comment on that because I know that you're going to. The reality is I was just looking at a comparison between all the LT1 designations. So that's what all of these things have in common. They don't have displacement in common. They're all basically LT1. So I want to show this name that Chevrolet has given each one of these combinations. Obviously, all of these combinations are different, and this one is different even more so than the other two because 6.2 liters, obviously it has a little bit of an advantage, but it has a lot of other advantages. It has a big jump in technology compared to the other two. First of all, it has direct injection, which in and of itself might not help it make more power, although it does allow you to run kind of on the ragged edge of it. It eliminates detonation almost because it only supplies fuel when there's the need for fuel. It doesn't have it in there ahead of time, so it can't pre-ignite. It makes it a lot harder to do that with direct injection. But the thing that direct injection really does is allow you to have more static compression. So this 6.2 liter LT1 has the highest static compression of all the three, even more so than the 11-to-1 motor back in the 1970s. So more compression, but it also has more head flow, and that's why they have the high lift camshaft. It can take advantage of that extra head flow offered by those LT1 heads. Those LT1 heads flow way more than either the Gen 2 head, which that head flows even more so than the Fuelie heads. The Gen 2 LT1 head is kind of the precursor of the Vortec head, which is kind of the high water mark for that original Gen 1 small block and Gen 2. I know the LT1 guys are going to yell at me for thinking that that's just kind of more like a standard small block Chevy than a Gen 2. But that head flows pretty well, but nothing compared to the modern head. Also, the intake manifold. The intake manifold on an LT1 or an L86 truck version is a long runner intake, much more like an LS version, and those manifolds work really well. They produce a lot of average power. Now, we talked a little bit about the camshaft being fairly mild on this 6.2 liter LT1, but the reality is it has an added advantage by having variable cam timing. So we can sweep the cam, advance or retard it. What that does is help this thing produce a lot of average power production. And we know that that works very well because I showed a comparison video, and that video is up already. You guys can check it out. A comparison between a 5.3 liter LM7, which is kind of the darling of the junkyard LS crowd, and compared that to an L83. Both run on the dyno in the same configuration. And the modern like LT version, that L83 version, partly because of the cam timing sweep, allows the thing to make a lot more average power than that LM7. It's a more modern version, and it just makes more power. And the same thing with this LT1. So 6.2 liters, more compression, variable cam, really good head flow, and a good intake manifold, and things like having a windage tray and stuff. All of those combine to help this thing make a lot more power than the other LT1s. This thing made 518 or 519 horsepower, 523 foot-pounds of torque, and not only did it make more peak numbers than the other two, it just makes more power everywhere. I can show you a comparison between this motor and the original 1970 LT1 motor, and as you can see, there's just no comparison. I mean, 353 horsepower versus 518 or 19 horsepower, and the torque, even though the original LT1 and the Gen 2 LT1 both had about 391 foot-pounds of torque, which they did very well, it's nothing compared to the 523 foot-pounds offered by the latest version. And even down here, we're talking about 488 foot-pounds versus 362. So what's that, 130 foot-pounds or so gain? You would definitely feel that. I mean, a modern LT1 is head and shoulders above the early ones, and we would expect that. It has decades of technology. It's working really well. It makes a lot of power, and so far, it's the best LT1 ever made. Let's get to our conclusion.
Okay guys, what'd you think about our comparison? LT1 versus LT1 versus LT1. The one comment I know I'm going to get is, hey, the last LT1 is 6.2 liters and it's not 350 inches like the other one, so it has it has an advantage. Yes, it does. It also has the advantage of several decades of technology, which really is the important part. Sure, it's bigger, but it's really better kind of in every way. It's got better cylinder heads, it's got a better intake manifold, it's got more compression, it's got variable cam, it has a windage tray, it has all kinds of cool stuff that the other motors don't have. You know, the benefit of decades of technology. That's kind of what makes it better, but they're all really cool. I like the original LT1. I'm a big fan. My first car when I was growing up was a 1970 and a half. We always throw the 70 and a half in there if you're an owner, because that's the coolest thing in the world, because they only made them halfway through the year because they made so many 69s. There was a big strike, yada yada yada. You guys can look all that up. Mine was unfortunately a base model rally sport. It was a split bumper, which was cool, but it had a small mild 2-barrel 350 in it, which we upgraded later on. And I did some more things to make it faster, put Coney shocks on it, springs, sway bars, all kinds of cool stuff. So that was a good car, brings back lots of memories, but it was not a Z28, which definitely would have been cool. And it was an automatic transmission, not a 4-speed, which was all the cool guys had. But I digress. Love the old LT1 stuff. That's definitely a cool car. Kind of one of my favorites just because that was my first car. I also really like the Gen 2 stuff, and I want to do more testing on that, as I've talked about several times. I want to get the LT1. I want to get the small version. I want to combine it. I want to make a modern, or less than modern now, DZ302 out of those two, which is going to be really cool. I also want to test more modern Gen 5 LT1 stuff. Now, I've run the L83, the 5.3 liter version, and we've done some testing on that, and it's equally impressive. And for those guys that are complaining about the displacement offered by the new LT1, yes, it has more displacement, but it also is going to make more power, and we know that because I've run the smaller 5.3 liter version, and even that little 5.3 liter truck motor makes a lot more power than either one of these LT1s. So it's not just displacement, it's a lot of technology, guys. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about this comparison. Let me know if you want to see other comparisons like this. I'm Richard Holdner. Like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff. Hands going. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll keep testing.